Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, under the gentle glow of imagined embers and the soft rhythm of crackling fire, we invite you to journey back in time. Let your mind drift, your body rest, and your breath slow. As shadows dance across the pages of history, we explore a tale wrapped in mystery, power, and quiet sorrow. The final days of Queen Elizabeth I and the questions that linger centuries later. Was it illness, grief, or something deeper still? Close your eyes, let the weight of the world fall away, and let us begin. Chapter 1. The Waning Crown. The year was 1602, and winter hung over England like a heavy, unshifting fog. At Whitehall Palace, a biting chill crept into every corridor, curling beneath stone arches and whispering through velvet drapes. Though fires roared and the hearths and braziers were lit in every chamber, the cold remained, uninvited, unyielding. Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, now nearly 70 years old, stood alone in her privy chamber, wrapped in a mantle of dark green velvet lined with sable. Her once bright red hair had long since turned a pale silver, though she still wore elaborate wigs, each one carefully coiffed and adorned with jeweled pins. A pearl necklace rested against her collarbone, and a ring bearing her mother Anne Boleyn's miniature sat firm on her right hand. The fire in her chamber flickered low. Its light danced across the oak-paneled walls, making the gilded roses of the Tudor crest shimmer like spirits in the shadows. Elizabeth stared into the flames as if seeking an answer in their restless motion. She had stood like that for over an hour, unmoving, silent. Not even Cat Ashley, her lifelong confidant, dared interrupt. For months now, the Queen had changed. Her wit, once sharp enough to silence whole courts, had grown measured, even distracted. Where once she bantered with scholars and poets, she now chose silence. The sparkle in her eyes, capable of enchanting even the most hardened lords, had dulled. Her appetite faded, her nights grew restless, and her famous temper flared with increasing unpredictability. But above all, it was the silence that alarmed her court. "Her Majesty has not spoken since morning," whispered Lady Mary Scrope to Sir Robert Cecil as they walked the gallery one late afternoon. "And yet she listens," Cecil replied, glancing back toward the guarded chamber. "She hears everything." "She frightens the young maids. They say she stares at the wall and mouths words to someone who isn't there." Sir Robert Cecil did not respond. He had served the Queen loyally for years and knew better than to spread gossip, even when it concerned matters of the crown. But in truth, he had noticed it too. Those moments when Elizabeth seemed to see something no one else could. She would turn her head sharply, eyes wide with recognition or fear, and then return to her long, strange silence. Some said it was age. Others whispered it was grief. The Earl of Essery, Robert Devereux, had been executed just 2 years earlier, and though Elizabeth never spoke of him again, those close to her swore they had heard her weeping at night. He had been like a son to her, or a lover, or both, depending on whom you asked. His betrayal had shattered something in her. Some claim she never recovered. But there were others, less charitable voices in the shadows of the court who murmured of darker causes, of slow poison, of curses from long-dead queens, of a soul haunted by guilt and the weight of too many ghosts.
In the stillness of the mirror, Elizabeth often found herself retreating into mirrors. She kept many around her, some gilded, some plain, some shaped like ovals or stars. They had followed her through the decades, from her youth and exile to her throne of glory. In them she studied herself daily, meticulously crafting the image of Gloriana, the eternal monarch. But lately, her own reflection seemed less willing to play along. One night, alone save for the fire, she stood before the mirror in her bedchamber. Her face stared back, not with vanity or sorrow, but with a calmness that unnerved her. She had not felt truly warm in weeks. Even beneath layers of silk and fur, there remained a chill in her bones, as though something had settled inside her and made itself at home. She leaned closer. Her eyes were rimmed with shadow, the whites tinged faintly yellow. She lifted a hand to her cheek. It felt paper-thin, cold. For a moment she thought she saw her reflection smile when she had not. She blinked. The mirror returned to stillness. But that night, as she lay in bed, fully clothed as she had taken to doing, she dreamed of fire, not the warm hearth kind, but of pyres and towers, of smoke and bells tolling in the distance. She saw the Tower of London, and within it her mother's flannel steps. Anne Boleyn walked barefoot on cold stone, a blindfold over her eyes. Elizabeth tried to scream, but no sound emerged. She awoke before dawn, sweat slicking her skin despite the cold.
The Astrologer's Warning. Early in spring, Dr. John Dee, long dismissed from court, sent a letter from Mortlake. It arrived folded in black wax and sealed with the symbol of Mercury. Sir Robert Cecil read it first and hesitated for 2 days before presenting it to the Queen. Elizabeth read the letter in silence. "Your Majesty," it read, "in the stars I see a convergence not known in our age. Mars and Saturn, the bringers of war and death, now cross paths with Venus, your own ruling sign. The eclipse to come may dim more than the sun. I beg you, guard your person and your soul." She folded the parchment, hands steady. "Did he write of any remedy?" she asked, without looking up. "No, Your Majesty," Cecil replied. "Then it is merely a warning, not a cure."
As weeks passed, Elizabeth withdrew further. She ceased most audiences, spoke in whispers when she spoke at all, and refused to sleep in her bed. Instead, she stood. For hours, some nights until dawn. Physicians were summoned and dismissed. They prescribed tonics of wormwood and gold leaf, infusions of sage and rosemary. One bold French doctor suggested a warm bath, a suggestion that caused Elizabeth to laugh sharply for the first time in weeks. A bath! You think water can undo what time has sown? Her council begged her to name a successor. She refused. "I am married to England," she said flatly. "There is no other heir." But she knew the truth. Her time was ending. Something, be it age, illness, or something unspoken, was coming for her.
The raven in the garden. One cold morning, the gardeners found a raven dead in the Queen's private garden. It had no visible wounds, no blood. Its eyes were open, glassy. Elizabeth was informed quietly. She insisted on seeing it. Wrapped in furs and with 2 guards at her side, she walked into the morning fog. The garden was silent, the frost crunching beneath her slippers. When she saw the bird, she knelt without hesitation. "Even the messengers have fallen," she murmured. "My lady," whispered Cat Ashley. Elizabeth looked up. "The raven. It is an omen. You know that, don't you?" Cat nodded slowly. She knew the queen had always been drawn to symbols and dreams. She had learned long ago never to question their meanings. Elizabeth ordered the raven buried beneath the rose arbor. Let no priest bless the grave. Let the earth decide what it was. The portrait that changed. In March, a new portrait arrived from the court painter. It was meant to be her last official likeness, one to mark the end of a reign, to stand for centuries. Elizabeth sat for it twice, though reluctantly. She had grown weary of posing, of being seen. When the painting was unveiled before her, she stared at it for a long time. "I do not recognize myself," she said. The painter stammered, "Your Majesty, I have painted you as you are, and as the realm sees you." Elizabeth approached the canvas. Her painted self stood tall, regally distant, dressed in gold and crimson, one hand resting on a globe, the other on a sword. Yet her eyes, those famed Tudor eyes, were hollow, sad, tired. She reached out and touched the canvas. "I was once a flame. Now I am the smoke that follows."
The last dance. It was late April when the court attempted one last celebration, a feast to mark the coming of spring. Musicians were hired, tapestries hung, the great hall filled with flickering candlelight and the scent of rosemary and wine. Elizabeth attended but did not eat. She sat at the high table, distant, watching the dancers as if they were ghosts. When the violin struck a familiar tune, one she had danced to in her youth, she stood slowly. The court hushed, and then, to everyone's amazement, she descended the steps and took to the floor, alone. She danced without partner or music, her arms outstretched, her body swaying like a willow. It was a slow, mournful dance, full of memory and sorrow. The court watched in silence, some with tears. When it ended, she collapsed into a chair, breathless. "I will dance no more," and she never did.
The days grew warmer, though the air inside Whitehall remained as still as a crypt. Outside, the Thames glimmered beneath a pale sun, boats drifting like memories on slow waters. But within the palace, time seemed suspended, caught between breaths and whispers. The queen no longer left her chambers. Her body was still present, but her spirit, some said, was already elsewhere. Yet the palace itself, ancient and vast, remained very much alive. And it had begun to murmur.
A discovery in the Northern Gallery. Lady Eleanor Danvers was not a woman prone to fancy. At 35, she had spent half her life in service to the crown. She wore her hair tight, her words tighter, and kept her devotion to Elizabeth like a secret stone pressed to her heart. But even Eleanor could not explain what she saw that morning in the Northern Gallery. It was just past sunrise. The rest of the court still slept. Eleanor walked the corridor alone, her steps echoing softly over the checkered floor. The gallery, lined with ancestral portraits and thick tapestries, always gave her pause. The faces on the walls seemed to watch, and the tapestries, woven with scenes of conquest, gardens, and myth, shifted subtly with every draft. She paused before the largest tapestry, one that stretched from ceiling to floor. It depicted the Garden of Eden, threaded in gold and green. Adam and Eve stood beneath the tree of knowledge, the serpent coiled around the branches, its eyes glinting red with garnet beads. That morning, something shimmered behind the serpent's coils, just at the edge of sight. A thread out of place. Eleanor stepped forward. At first, she thought it was a tear, a simple snag. But as her fingers brushed the spot, she felt it, a seam, carefully stitched over. It was recent work, and it didn't match the original weaving. Her fingers worked quickly, carefully. She loosened the seam and something fell from behind the tapestry, landing with a soft flutter at her feet. A letter, folded in four, the paper yellowed but intact, sealed not with wax, but with a crimson ribbon threaded through. She looked around, no one. Heart pounding, Eleanor picked it up and tucked it into her sleeve.
Back in her chamber, Eleanor unfastened the ribbon. The parchment crackled as it unfolded. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, but unfamiliar. She read, "To she who wears the crown, beware the man with the sparrow ring. He moves in whispers and drinks with ghosts. Poison is not always swallowed. It may also be breathed. He speaks of loyalty. He walks with angels, but his heart is hollow. Do not trust the one who prays most often. The rose has thorns still, and the last petal is falling." There was no signature, no name, no date. Eleanor read the letter again and again. Then she burned it. But it was too late. The words had taken root.
The ring of the sparrow. Eleanor began watching the court more closely. The queen, now barely seen even by her council, remained locked in silence. Her ladies rotated in and out, taking shifts like nurses tending a relic. But it was the men Eleanor studied. The lords, the priests, the visitors who still passed through the antechambers of power. One caught her attention. He was a newcomer to court, a clergyman, or at least dressed as one. He wore black, always black, with a silver chain tucked beneath his robe. He carried a small Bible and often stood alone in the chapel, murmuring prayers to no one in particular. But what Eleanor noticed most was the ring. On his left hand, he wore a signet of silver, shaped like a sparrow in flight. She asked discreetly after him. His name was Father Matthias Hale, sent from York, a scholar, a priest, and, according to Sir Francis Bacon, a man of deep learning and impeccable conduct. Eleanor was not convinced. She began trailing him discreetly, like a shadow. She watched him disappear behind the chapel door after hours. She noticed he never touched food in public, nor spoke above a whisper. Once she saw him remove the sparrow ring and kiss its face, then press it against the floor beneath the queen's prayer stool. She knew then what she must do.
A visit to the queen's bedchamber. Late one evening, Eleanor requested an audience with the queen, not as a courtier, but as a woman in need of confession. Cat Ashley, aged and watchful, granted her entry. Elizabeth sat not on her throne, but beside the fire, wrapped in black. Her hair, half undressed, spilled over one shoulder like faded flame. She did not look up as Eleanor knelt before her. "My queen," Eleanor whispered, "there are words I must speak." Elizabeth blinked slowly. "I have seen letters. I have seen men who wear rings like birds. I have seen your tapestries speak in secrets." Still, the queen did not respond. But her hand moved just slightly and reached for the fire iron. She stirred the embers. "They say you are dying," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking. "But I do not believe death comes without warning. I believe it has already entered the palace." Elizabeth finally turned her head, and for the first time in weeks she spoke. "You see much, Lady Davis." Her voice was thin, hoarse. "But even the wise sometimes mistake dreams for signs. Eleanor bowed her head. "Have you dreamt, Majesty?" Elizabeth looked again into the fire. "Every night, my father's voice, my mother's face, and the shadow that stands behind them." Then, very softly, "Do not trust the ring." The codex beneath the floor. Within days of that audience, Eleanor received an unexpected visitor, Thomas Brown, one of the royal scribes. He came in secret, carrying an old book wrapped in cloth. "It was found beneath a floorboard in the old library wing," he told her. "I was told you might know what to do with it." She unwrapped it carefully. The cover was leather, cracked with age. No title, just an impression of a thorned rose. Inside, pages written in a cipher. One Eleanor recognized. It was the same script used by Mary, Queen of Scots, during her imprisonment. Eleanor had studied it in her youth. She spent hours decoding. What emerged was a series of correspondences from unknown writers, addressed to someone named simply the Dove. They spoke of infiltration, of the court's weakness, of a long game coming to an end. And again, the sparrow, over and over, as symbol, as signature, as omen.
The Queen fades further. By mid-May, Elizabeth refused all physicians. She neither ate nor drank more than a few sips of water. Her limbs trembled, her lips paled, and yet she still resisted the bed, preferring to sit or stand, eyes fixed on something unseen. She spoke only once more that week, to Cat Ashley, asking for the miniature of Robert Devereux. "It is gone, Majesty," Cat said softly. Elizabeth said nothing, but a single tear tracked down her cheek. That night, she ordered all mirrors removed from her chamber. The priest unmasked. Eleanor made her move. She waited until twilight, when the chapel was least occupied. She entered quietly, moving behind the altar. There, in the shadow of the crucifix, stood Father Hale, alone as usual. He turned when she stepped forward. "My lady," he said, bowing, "have you come to pray?" "I have come for the truth." She stared at his hand. "You serve no God, I know." The priest's face did not change, but his eyes, so dark they were nearly black, shone with something sharp. "You read the letters," he said. Eleanor nodded. "Then you know the Queen has ruled long enough." "She is England." "No, she was, but England is changing." He stepped forward. "You cannot stop what is already sown." And then he reached for his ring. Eleanor moved faster. She drew the blade from beneath her cloak and struck, not to kill, but to sever. The ring fell to the chapel floor, clinking against stone. Hell cried out, not in pain, but in fury. He turned and fled, vanishing through the side door before guards could be summoned. They searched for him 3 days. He was never seen again. The petal falls. 3 days later, a rose was found on the Queen's writing table. White, fresh, but with a single petal fallen beside it. When asked if she had placed it there, Elizabeth said nothing, but those who stood with her swore she smiled.
Chapter 3. The Alchemist's Prophecy. The moon hung pale over Whitehall like a coin worn thin with prayer. It was now early March, 1603. The Queen had not spoken more than a sentence in a fortnight. She had refused all medicine. She would not eat, she would not sleep. The fire in her chambers burned low, while outside England simmered with uncertainty. The Virgin Queen, the Gloriana of legend, stood at the edge of death, and someone had seen it coming.
A visitor from Mortlake. The letter arrived by hand. It bore no crest, only a wax seal etched with a phoenix, an ancient emblem of death and rebirth. Delivered under cover of darkness, it came not through the official courier, but via a young court musician who claimed it had been pressed into his palm at the edge of St. James Park by a man in scholar's robes who vanished like smoke. Sir Robert Cecil opened it himself. The writing inside was unmistakable. Dr. John Dee. The Queen's former astrologer, advisor, mathematician, and alchemist. Once trusted above all others in the court, Dee had fallen from favor years earlier, retreating to his home in Mortlake after being accused of conjuring spirits and dabbling in necromancy. Yet few understood the hidden currents of courtly fate as he did. The letter was short. The end draws near, not of England, but of the rose herself. I have seen the signs in glass and star, in the cracked mirror and the turning wheel. She must choose, yield to sleep, or let shadow claim her. The poison is not in her blood, it is in her memory. I will come once more if I am received. Cecil burned the letter. But 2 nights later, Dee was in Whitehall.
The Queen's astrologer returns. He was thinner than when last seen at court, and older, his white beard longer, his eyes sunken into a face more bone than flesh. He wore scholar's robes of black velvet, stained with ink. Around his neck hung a silver medallion, a 7-pointed star. They brought him through the back passages, avoiding the eyes of gossip-hungry nobles. In the Queen's outer chamber, Cot Ashley met him with hesitation. "She will not see you," Cot whispered. "She sees no one." Dee raised one thin finger. "She will know I am here." And he was right. For the first time in over a week, Elizabeth turned her eyes to the door. "Let him in," she whispered. The crystal and the crown. Dr. Dee entered without bow or flourish. He carried with him a velvet cloth, beneath which lay his tools, a crystal scrying mirror, black obsidian from Mexico, and an astrolabe etched with Latin prayers. These had once guided Elizabeth's greatest triumphs. She had asked for them before the Armada. She had consulted him before the deaths of rebels. Now they returned for one last prophecy. He knelt before her. "My queen," he said, his voice rough with age, "I come not with certainty, but with seeing." Elizabeth looked into his eyes. "And what do you see?" He uncovered the obsidian mirror. The room seemed to darken as he raised it toward the firelight. "I see a throne of white stone, but no figure upon it. I see a rose dropping petals into water. I see your crown placed upon a cushion, but no hand lifts it." Elizabeth did not flinch. "Speak plainly," she said. "I see your end, Majesty," Dee answered, "but not through murder, through memory. The spirit cannot bear what the body has survived. You are not dying of poison or plague. You are dying of regret." A Queen's confession. Silence fell again. Then Elizabeth, voice quiet, said, "And yet I have no heir." Dr. Dee bowed his head. "Who would you name?" she asked. "I am not a statesman, but you are a seer." He hesitated. "Then I will say this. The one who walks in your shadow has waited long." She understood. James of Scotland, son of her cousin Mary, whom she had ordered executed. It was the inevitable choice, but not a comforting one. The question of legacy. That night, Elizabeth finally asked for writing materials, a rare act. She wrote not letters, but lists, names of nobles she trusted,
towns she remembered from her progresses, even the names of animals from her youth, a favorite hunting hawk, a greyhound, a horse she had once called Valor. She burned each list after writing it. "They must not be remembered," she said to Cat Ashley. Cat wept. The stars align. On March 20th, the moon entered Pisces. Dr. D requested one final audience. He brought with him a chart of planetary alignments, showing Mars descending and Saturn in ascendancy, a sign, he explained, of transition and inheritance. "Majesty," he said, "your chart now mirrors that of the day you became queen." Elizabeth closed her eyes. "I have ruled too long," she whispered. "No, Majesty. You ruled exactly as long as you were meant to." She turned to face the fire. Her voice trembled. "I am ready."
The alchemist departed. Dr. D left the palace before dawn. He was not seen again in court. It is said he returned to Mortlake and died alone, surrounded by manuscripts no one could decipher. Some say he left behind a final prophecy, hidden in a cipher among the margins of Queen Elizabeth's own prayer book. If it exists, it has never been found.
Chapter 4. The Shadow of the Successor. The Queen was dying, and all of England leaned toward the throne, waiting for the shape of its future. Whitehall was still wrapped in hush, but within its walls power had already begun to move. Ministers whispered behind closed doors. Letters were drafted and dispatched. Allies were counted. Foes were watched. And one name echoed louder than any other: James Stuart, King of Scots. The unspoken heir. Elizabeth had never named an heir. For over 40 years she had walked the knife edge of succession with unmatched cunning. She knew the dangers of naming a successor too early. It gave men ambition and rebels a cause. She had seen what happened to monarchs who offered the throne too easily. Her father had beheaded wives to secure his legacy. Her cousin Mary had been imprisoned and executed for daring to claim it. But now time was no longer on her side, and silence, once a weapon, had become a threat. Sir Robert Cecil knew it, and so he prepared. Cecil's secret correspondence. For years, Cecil had been corresponding in secret with James VI of Scotland. Though outwardly loyal only to Elizabeth, he had begun building a quiet bridge to the next monarch, hedging the kingdom's future against the inevitable. In 1601, he had begun the first careful feelers, coded in letters, often delivered through agents disguised as merchants. By 1602, the communications had become more frequent, more bold. Cecil knew that chaos would consume England if Elizabeth died without a clear successor. The nobility would splinter, Catholics might rise, foreign powers could invade, and civil war could bleed the realm. James was Protestant, royal by blood, and crucially, willing to wait. Now, with Elizabeth near her end, Cecil moved swiftly. On March 23, 1603, he sent a final letter to Edinburgh. "The Queen waxeth weaker. The matter proceedeth swiftly. Prepare thyself, for the crown may soon be thine. But come not until the breath is gone. There must be no appearance of haste."
The council divided.
Not all in the Privy Council agreed. Some distrusted James. His mother had been a Catholic traitor. His rule in Scotland was marked by turbulence, and his manner, they said, lacked the grace of an English sovereign. The Earl of Northumberland murmured of Arabella Stuart, another Tudor descendant and more easily influenced. The Howard family looked toward Catholic Spain, dreaming perhaps of reconciliation. But Cecil held the council tightly. "We must not be the men who unmade England," he said, his voice iron. "James is the best hope for peace." And few could argue. The Queen's final consent. Elizabeth had not risen from her cushions in 4 days. Her voice was nearly gone, but her mind, when it surfaced, was clear. She spoke little, and only when asked directly. She would not sign anything. She would not be moved. Cecil came to her alone on the morning of March 24th. He knelt beside her bed, his voice low, gentle, the same voice that had served her through Spanish wars and Irish rebellions. "Majesty," he said, Bingland begs for your will. Whom do you name?" She did not answer. "Majesty," he said again, "if you die silent, we cannot protect the peace. I beg you, by your love of the people, by your oath to the realm." She opened her eyes. "James," she whispered. Cecil leaned forward. "James of Scotland?" She gave a slight nod, then closed her eyes again. It was the closest thing to a royal decree England would ever receive.
Within the hour, Cecil summoned the other members of the council and relayed the Queen's words. He recorded them in a private memorandum to be secured and shown to Parliament if needed. Outside the chamber, courtiers began to pack. Ambassadors drafted letters to foreign courts. London's printers sharpened their presses. The Queen still breathed, but the country was already beginning to change. The end comes. At 2 in the morning on March 24th, 1603, Elizabeth Regina, Queen of England and Ireland, drew her last breath. Lady Cat Ashley held her hand. The room was lit only by the embers of the fire and a single candle on the mantel. "She sleeps," whispered Cat, and she did not wake. The Queen was dead. A new dawn. By the time the first bells rang in London, Cecil dispatched riders north with sealed letters for James VI. He would be King James I of England before the week was out. The transition was swift, planned with surgical care, carried out with urgency. There was no civil war, no foreign invasion, no revolt in the streets. In the end, Gloriana had passed her crown to a man she never met, and England had entered a new age. Legacy in ashes and gold. Elizabeth's death did not bring immediate collapse. Instead, it marked the end of a myth. The Tudor sun had set. The Virgin Queen, who had ruled with unmatched charisma and ruthless grace, was gone. And yet, her story had only begun to become legend. For even as her body was prepared for burial, ballads were sung of her glory, pamphlets printed of her wisdom, and poems etched into the margins of Bibles. She had ruled with silence, and now her silence ruled them all.
Chapter 5. Funeral of a Myth. She is not dead. She only sleeps beneath the marble crown. Ballad sung by London children, April 1603. A city in mourning. London awoke to muffled bells. By the second day after the Queen's death, black drapery had begun to hang from the windows of merchant houses.
The cobblestones of Cheapside were swept clean by dawn, though the air still smelled of soot and smoke. From the steeples of St. Paul's in Westminster, a deep tolling marked each passing hour. Even the Thames seemed quieter. The city grieved not just a monarch, but a symbol. Elizabeth Tudor had reigned for 44 years. For most of her subjects, she was the only sovereign they had ever known. To them, her passing was not merely a royal death, it was the loss of England's mother. From woman to icon. Even before her body was cold, the Queen's myth was being constructed. Her counselors, especially Sir Robert Cecil, understood the power of narrative. If the nation was to accept a foreign-born king without rebellion, the Queen's legacy needed to be enshrined, not just as ruler, but as saint. And so they acted swiftly. The heralds began preparations for a royal funeral the likes of which England had never seen. Printers issued commemorative woodcuts, Elizabeth surrounded by roses, hallowed like a Madonna. Poets were paid to craft elegies that praised her virginity, her wisdom, her justice. She became, in word and image, more than a queen. She became Gloriana, eternal and untouchable. The secret of the death mask. In a chamber beneath the Tower of London, Elizabeth's death mask was cast in wax. Few were present, only the royal surgeon, 2 artists from the Guild of Makers, and a priest. The mold would be used to fashion a lifelike effigy for the funeral procession. When the cloth was lifted, silence filled the room. Even in death, her face bore an eerie dignity. The sharpness of her cheekbones, the long arch of her nose, the lips slightly parted, as if ready to speak. But it was the eyes, hollow and fixed, that unnerved them most. "She does not look dead, only waiting," whispered one of the artists. The effigy, once completed, was placed atop her coffin. It would ride in her place through London.
The procession. On April 28, 1603, 5 weeks after her death, Elizabeth was laid to rest. The funeral procession stretched over a mile. Drums rolled like thunder as knights and heralds marched in full armor. Nobles rode black-caped horses. Clergy chanted psalms. Behind them, 4 horses drew the hearse, an immense structure draped in black velvet, edged with silver, and topped by the wax figure of the Queen in full regalia. Over 1,000 mourners followed. From windows, balconies, and rooftops, tens of thousands watched in silence. Children tossed rosemary sprigs. Old women wept into handkerchiefs. Veterans of the Armada touched their swords. And merchants whispered prayers not for the Queen, but for peace. As the hearse passed through Ludgate and down Fleet Street, Londoners knelt in the streets. Some believed it was the last great pageant of Old England. They were not wrong. The Abbey tomb. Elizabeth was buried in Westminster Abbey, alongside her half-sister, Mary I. A strange choice, many thought, given their bitter rivalry in life. But Elizabeth had long feared being buried alone. Better to be entombed beside a sister than to vanish into memory. Her marble tomb bore the inscription, "Partners in throne and grave, here we rest sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of resurrection." Yet even in death they were unequal. Above Mary's name, Elizabeth's effigy lay larger, higher, brighter. The message was clear. Gloriana still ruled. The first shadow of the new reign. Just days after the funeral, James Stuart crossed into England. He was met with mixed emotion, respect, relief, curiosity, but not love. James was no Elizabeth.
He lacked her wit, her poise, her gift for theater. Where she had ridden through plague-ridden streets to comfort her people, James preferred the safety of his hunting lodge. Where she had danced before ambassadors to buy time for diplomacy, he spoke plainly and too often. Rumors began to stir. "The King of Scots is not our queen," some said. And so Elizabeth's legend grew even greater in death.
A poet's vigil. In the months after her burial, a young poet named Ben Jonson stood often in the shadow of her tomb. He had once written masques for her court. He had watched her from afar, at banquets, on progress, from balconies. He had feared her, yes, but he had also loved her in the strange way that all England had. One evening, he wrote, "She lies not beneath stone, but in every mirror. Look upon your daughter's eyes, your lover's smile. There she lives. We are not a country. We are her echo." His words were copied and reprinted across England. The invention of immortality. With each passing season, Elizabeth grew less human and more mythical. Painters revised her portraits, making her younger, purer, more divine. Historians softened her decisions, downplayed her mistakes. Writers immortalized her as a beacon of reason in an age of chaos. The woman who once wept over the death of Essex. The queen who spent her last weeks refusing to lie down. The monarch who could not name an heir until her final breath became Gloriana, flawless and eternal. But myths, like monarchs, have their own price.
The powder beneath the throne. In the autumn of 1605, tensions reached a deadly crescendo. A group of Catholic dissidents, frustrated by continued persecution and emboldened by dreams of vengeance, plotted to blow up Parliament on its opening day. Their goal was to kill the king, his ministers, and as many members of the Protestant nobility as possible, then raise a Catholic monarch in his place. At the center of this conspiracy stood a soldier named Guy Fawkes, and the plan became known as the Gunpowder Plot. It was discovered at the 11th hour when a letter sent by an anonymous sympathizer reached the authorities. Guards searched the vaults beneath the House of Lords and found Fawkes, cloaked in a cape, standing beside 36 barrels of gunpowder. He was arrested, tortured, and confessed. Legacy of ashes. James survived. The nation rallied. Thanksgiving services were held in every parish. Bonfires were lit. But something had changed. James had hoped to rule with love and peace. Instead, he now ruled by fear and suspicion. The Parliament passed harsher laws against Catholics. Jesuits were hunted. Citizens were forced to take oaths denying the Pope's authority. And throughout the country, churches rang bells, not for salvation, but for survival. In the public mind, Elizabeth's golden age began to look ever more luminous. The Queen returns in words. Even in the wake of attempted regicide, Elizabeth's name was invoked like a charm. Pamphlets were printed reminding the people of how she defeated the Spanish Armada. Poets wrote verses comparing her unwavering hand to James's faltering one. In every play, pageant, and poem, she emerged more legendary than ever. Shakespeare himself, now nearing the end of his career, penned King Lear, a tragic vision of a ruler undone by misplaced trust. Though it bore no name, many whispered it was James's mirror and Elizabeth's ghost behind the glass. The King's Lament. In private moments, James confessed to his courtiers, "I have the crown, yet not the command. She who never married still holds the heart of this land. My sword may rule, but her shadow reigns." He was not a tyrant, nor fool. He understood politics, scripture, diplomacy, but he lacked the theatrical fire that Elizabeth had wielded so naturally, and he knew it. The lingering ghost. In Whitehall Palace, a chamber once used by Elizabeth was closed off for decades. Some claimed to hear whispers inside. Others said her footsteps echoed at dusk. A few servants refused to enter it entirely. The truth was more symbolic than supernatural. Elizabeth was everywhere, in thought, in memory, in expectation. She was the measure against which all rulers would be judged. And James, for all his learning, could not outrun her.
Chapter 6. The King in Her Shadow. He wears the crown, but she holds the throne. Whispered among the court, 1604. The first days of a new dawn. When James VI of Scotland crossed into England in the spring of 1603, he arrived with hope, books, and a Scottish retinue that did not speak the customs of the English court. To many, he was a stranger, unfamiliar in voice, in manner, even in his gait. Where Elizabeth had commanded silence with a glance, James muttered and rambled. Where she had dazzled in cloth of gold, he preferred thick wool and long sermons. The contrast was stark, unflattering. "Is this to be the heir of Gloriana?" the courtiers whispered. The ink had barely dried on Elizabeth's tomb, and already her memory had become a weapon. The inheritance of unease. Catholics had hoped at first that the new monarch might favor them. After all, his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had died a Catholic. Yet within months, James reaffirmed Protestant supremacy, reissued anti-Catholic laws, and declared his loyalty to the Church of England. Puritans, who had tolerated Elizabeth's ambiguity, now demanded stricter reforms. But James rejected their millenniary petition, reminding them that he had no desire to have bishops governed by presbyters, a jab at the Scottish Kirk that had so often defied his authority in the north. He had hoped to be a unifying king, the peacemaker between peoples, the bringer of a new era. Instead, he found himself isolated. Even his court grew suspicious of his Scottish favorites, especially Robert Carr, whose rapid rise sparked envy and disdain. Court of the Forgotten Queen. Though she was gone, Elizabeth's court still lingered. Portraits of her remained in the great halls. Her motto, Semper Eadem, always the same, was carved in tapestries and wood panels. Her former ladies, old and silver-haired, spoke of her with reverence. Ministers like Robert Cecil still spoke of her in the present tense. James, who had long admired her from afar, now found her legacy a burden. "How is a man to rule when even the walls whisper her name?" he once asked in frustration. The Mask of Peace. Determined to solidify his rule, James pursued peace with Spain, a policy Elizabeth had long resisted. In 1604, the Treaty of London was signed, ending nearly 2 decades of intermittent war. To many in England, this was a betrayal. Elizabeth had been the warrior queen, the defender against the Catholic menace. Peace with Spain felt like a retreat, like surrender. James called it wisdom. His enemies called it weakness. But he did not end. Chapter 7. Gloriana Rewritten. "She who never wed became England's bride, and in her memory truth were a crown of gold." Thomas Dekker, 1610. The death of a woman, the birth of a legend. In the immediate years following her death, Elizabeth Tudor ceased to be a monarch. She became a symbol, not of politics, not of religion, but of England itself. The careful construction of her myth had begun even before she was buried. But now, under the reign of James I, with his Scottish manners, foreign tastes, and unpopular favorites, the contrast was sharpened. Gloriana,
Elizabeth the Eternal became the lost paradise. Her flaws were forgiven, her silence sanctified, and most importantly, her memory became a political tool. Stage and scroll. Playwrights, poets, and pamphleteers all found in Elizabeth a muse, but they did not tell the truth. They told what the people longed to remember. In public performances and court masques, Elizabeth was depicted as Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice who fled the world when it became too corrupt. In these plays, she was not dead, only vanished, her spirit waiting for England to prove itself worthy again. Ben Jonson, once her court poet, rewrote odes to her, portraying her as divinely ordained, incorruptible, surrounded by celestial fire. Shakespeare, now in his twilight years, subtly echoed her presence in his late plays, Cymbeline, The Tempest, Henry VIII, each with a wise queen, each with echoes of Elizabeth's voice. It was literature as resurrection. And in doing so, the bards reshaped England's past. Political use of the Virgin Queen. But it was not only artists who manipulated her memory. Politicians did too. James's court, wary of public nostalgia, began quietly commissioning tracts that emphasized Elizabeth's failings, her indecision, her vanity, her favoritism. They reminded people of the Irish Wars, the execution of Mary Stuart, and her failure to secure a successor. But these efforts largely backfired. The more they tried to tarnish her, the brighter she glowed. The public rejected the criticism as jealousy. Elizabeth had become untouchable, almost divine. Even her enemies spoke her name with caution.
The people's queen. It was the common folk who preserved her myth most fiercely. In taverns and churches, her name was spoken in reverence. In rural villages, old coins bearing her image were hung in cottages to keep away storms. Women named their daughters Elizabeth, not for fashion, but for hope. Folk songs told of how she walked among the poor in disguise, offering alms. Ballads claim she still rode through the mist at night, protecting the land from foreign kings and Catholic ghosts. She was no longer just Gloriana. She was Britannia, Mother England, the last true monarch. The silent weapon of nostalgia. Ironically, the more unstable England became under James, the more stable Elizabeth's image appeared. When James dissolved Parliament in 1611, protests in London carried banners with her initials, ER. When plague returned in 1609, some claimed it was punishment for how poorly her memory had been treated. The past, it seemed, had become more powerful than the present. And for the first time, her memory was used not only for unity, but also for resistance. Elizabeth and the Catholic mind. Even among English Catholics, long her enemies, a strange affection emerged. She had persecuted them, yes, but she had also protected them from the fires of European crusades. She had refused to turn England into a second Geneva. Some Jesuit writers began to depict her as a misguided soul led by clever counselors rather than a tyrant. In Spanish courts, ambassadors spoke of her dignity in death, her unmatched ability to hold a divided kingdom together. One Venetian envoy wrote in 1606, "She governed with a man's mind and a lioness's heart. In her, majesty overcame religion." A portrait in gold and smoke. In 1613, on the 10th anniversary of her death, a new portrait of Elizabeth was unveiled in the Guildhall. She was shown standing on a map of England, her foot resting on London, eyes staring eastward. The gown was crimson and silver, embroidered with roses, suns, and swords. Behind her, a storm raged,
but her face remained calm. No such scene had ever occurred. It was entirely invented. But no one questioned it. It had become more real than memory. James's quiet resentment. James I, for all his learning and efforts, could never escape her shadow. He privately admitted to his friend, the poet John Donne, "They love her because she is gone. They will never love me until I am." He forbade public commemorations of her death. He had her portraits removed from royal chambers. But he could not erase her from the people's hearts. In his final years, James stopped speaking of her altogether. But she remained on coins, in churches, in the lullabies mothers sang to their children. Legacy as politics. By the time of his death in 1625, Elizabeth was no longer a Tudor queen. She was a national ideal. She was the last English monarch to embody absolute unity before the wars, before the civil strife, before the axe would fall on a king's neck. For those who feared the chaos to come, her memory was a kind of sanctuary. The historians called her reign the Elizabethan Golden Age. The poets called her Time's daughter, and the people called her simply our Queen.
Chapter 8. The Final Reckoning. Her tongue refused, but her body confessed. In the stillness her soul spoke louder than any trumpet. Sir John Harrington, Private Diary, 1603. The Silence at Richmond. On a grey March morning in 1603, Queen Elizabeth I lay motionless in her chamber at Richmond Palace. She had not spoken in days. She refused food, drink, even a cushion for rest. She sat unsleeping on a pile of silk pillows, staring at nothing. Courtiers came and went, but she acknowledged none of them. Physicians stood helpless. Bishops prayed. Servants wept in silence. There were no declarations, no final speeches, no royal blessings. The woman who commanded armies with her words now died without them. Whispers behind the curtains. From the first hour of her death, rumors flourished. Some claimed she had seen visions of her mother, Anne Boleyn, of dead suitors, of the Spanish Armada sailing in shadows beyond the Thames. Others whispered of poison, though no signs of it were found. Still more believed she had died of grief or guilt or the burden of too many secrets. Sir Robert Cecil, who orchestrated the peaceful transfer of power to James I, ensured no autopsy was performed. Her death was declared natural, the end of a long life. But what exactly ended, no one could say. The Mask of Glory. For most of her reign, Elizabeth had worn a mask of invincibility, a flawless white face, pearl-encrusted gowns, and carefully curated words. But in her final months, the mask slipped. Eyewitnesses described her face as gaunt, her teeth blackened, her eyes sunken with sorrow. Her once celebrated memory failed. She repeated names of old friends long dead, Robert Dudley, Mary Sidney, Francis Walsingham. Most disturbingly, she refused the sacrament. The Queen who had led the Protestant cause did not ask for a priest. She spoke no scripture. She offered no confession. To her counselors, this was alarming. To her enemies, it was proof that even she feared what came next.
A hidden illness. Modern scholars have long speculated about the true cause of Elizabeth's death.
The official record gives no clear explanation. Several theories persist: blood poisoning from decaying teeth, pneumonia or bronchitis brought on by months of cold and depression, staged starvation, an act of willful death rather than a medical failure, or, most controversially, a form of melancholia, what we would today call clinical depression. Sir John Harrington, her godson, wrote, "She will not speak of Dudley, nor of Burghley, nor of the late Earl of Essex, yet I feel all three dwell within her heart as guests unwelcome, yet unbanished." Her emotional grief, from the execution of Essex, from decades of self-isolation, from the weight of power, may have unraveled her spirit before her body gave way. A chamber sealed. After her death, her chamber was sealed for weeks. Servants were dismissed. Tapestries were burned. Her gowns were divided among the maids. Her personal papers were taken by Cecil and never made public. Among the missing were letters to foreign princes, a private diary rumored to be kept since 1563, medical records, and a mysterious locked coffer with no known key. Some say James ordered the removal of these items to protect his own legitimacy. Others believe they were destroyed to protect Elizabeth's myth. What was in them? No one knows. But the silence that surrounded her life continued in death. A crown in the tomb. When Elizabeth was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, it was beside her half-sister Mary I, the Catholic queen she had once imprisoned. Above their tomb is written, "Partners in throne and grave, though foes in life." It is a poetic irony that the Protestant Savior lies beside the Catholic flame. But perhaps more revealing is what is not written. There is no epitaph by Elizabeth's own hand. She had once said, "I will not make a monument of words. My reign shall be carved in history, not stone." And it was, but not as she would have written it. The secret that endures. Centuries later, the question still lingers. Why did Elizabeth die in silence? Was it despair? A final act of control? A refusal to cede authority even to death? Or was it something more? Some historians suggest she died in silence because she had become silence, a living myth, no longer a woman. In her refusal to speak, she maintained power over her own ending. Unlike so many monarchs who die begging, confessing, or commanding, Elizabeth vanished like mist in the morning sun. The Queen's last word. There is one final record, hidden in a letter, discovered centuries later in the papers of Lady Scrope, her last attending noblewoman. It reads, "She pressed my hand before the end, though she could not say a word. I asked if she feared death. She looked at me as if to say, 'What is left to fear?' And when her breath left her, it was not with pain, but peace." That perhaps was her final word, not spoken, but understood. Epilogue. A silence that speaks. Today, Elizabeth I remains one of the most enigmatic figures in history. Her reign is studied, dramatized, immortalized. Her speeches are recited. Her likeness adorns coins, stamps, and schoolbooks. But her death, the moment of ultimate vulnerability, is still wrapped in mystery. And perhaps that is how she wanted it. In silence, she preserved her greatest illusion. In silence, she became eternal.